Mai hara mai ngā whānau, ko tai mai nei ki tēnei kaupapa. Nau mahara mai ngā whānau o te moana nui a Kiwa. Tino hari koa mātou te whānau o te whare wānanga o Awanui, te whare wānanga Aronui o Tāmaki Makaurau. Ko reira ki te mihi nui atu ki a koutou. Tino pāpā taku ngā kau ko tū mai nei ki te tautoko tēnei kaupapa. Te kaupapa tino ua, tino hariko o te ngākau o te kai tui tui. Nō reira whānau, nau mai, piki mai, kake mai, haere mai. Aha koe toru aku nei kupu, ka nui te mihi, ka nui te hari o tōku ngākau, ko tai mai nei koutou, nō reira tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome whānau, friends, and from far and from near to the book launch.
Yeah, this book is pretty comprehensive in terms of its coverage from the east to the west, north to the South Pacific, as far as Africa, and it's a journey of discovery for David. It's a journey not only in terms of dealing with Pacific issues, also in terms of highlighting some of those issues to the rest of the world, given the fact that the Pacific is significantly marginal in terms of coverage in world affairs. So the books by David have been instrumental in shining lights on the Pacific.
We're very proud of the Pacific Media Centre, and of course David is its director. And there are many people here tonight who are part of that advisory committee who work very hard to support David in the growth and development of that centre. The centre draws most of its students actually from the School of Communications, but more widely than that. And I see lots of colleagues and students here tonight too, so welcome to you all. So a little bit about David. We're, as I said, proud of the Pacific Media Centre and particularly proud of his sustained work. As you've heard, he's been working in this area on Pacific media for many, many years. And I think to sustain that interest is hugely important, both for the university, but also for I guess, world politics. David is one of our A-rated researchers, and I think he's the only professor of journalism in New Zealand. And some of you will have heard his professorial address, which gave us an insight into his astonishing career. So I think that will do from an introduction from the university, and thank you very much for being here, and I'm absolutely delighted that we're celebrating the launch of another new book. So congratulations, David.
There are a few words I'd like to say about the book itself. I've read it a number of times. Each time it's a bit of a shock, because I'm not a great fan of the series, but it is like an entire series of a Game of Thrones. There's injustice, inequality, brutality. It's all there. The shame of it is that it's not a work of fiction. It's not an entertainment. It's what has happened in the Pacific and continues to happen to some extent or other. So the book, as you say, has extremely wide coverage, but it's very dramatic in that coverage. One of the things it highlights is just how widespread the tragedies of the Pacific are. And there are many deaths reported in this book. Some are valiant, but most are tragic, and one would say unnecessary. It's been very important to us to be able to support a work that is not only asks journalists to do a good job, but to do a job that is good. And we like that. We're very proud of this enterprise.
We're going to have Sandra Kailahi, who's the chair of the Pacific Islands Media Association, or PIMA, who's going to launch the book on behalf of Barbara Driver of TV New Zealand.
Atu, malo lele, ni sambuli vilaka, talo falava, kia orana, halo olaketa, namaste, and warm Pacific greetings on this evening. Unfortunately, I'm not as significant as Barbara, but I will try and do the best that I can. I have known David Robie for a good number of years now and was very honoured to have him attend our first Pacific Island Media Association conference here at AUT, and that relationship has developed and blossomed since then. And all I can say is thank goodness the Pacific has David Robie. His work and his passion for Pacific media and for justice and for the rights of our people and all Indigenous people is just amazing. And we're so grateful, David, for your passion and commitment to the Pacific Island Media Association, PIMA, but also to journalists and to all Pacific media journalists who have come through this institution and gone on to do great things. Barbara is away. She is, I think she might be in Tuvalu right now, or Christmas Island, but she's on a very quick junket trip with the Honourable Murray McCulley. So she's very sad that she couldn't make it here today. She wanted to launch this book, but she did alert David that this might happen, and being the only Pacific correspondent in New Zealand, this obviously was going to happen. But she has left me with something that she would like me to read to officially launch the book. So Don't Spoil My Beautiful Face takes the readers on a journey through a sometimes unfamiliar Pacific, and it's a road you can't help thinking you should be travelling on. West Papua, Bougainville, Fiji. It's every journalist's conscience. If it's not, then it should be. The stories explored in Don't Spoil My Beautiful Face are vitally important and delightfully varied, from the Hagahai tribesmen whose blood cells have been patented by the US to the struggles of Tonga's media over the years with the public's right to know under threat. David Robie has been at the forefront of Pacific journalism for decades, bringing his brand of measured thoughtfulness, courage and balance. His account of reporting in the Philippines on the forgotten victims of a silent war in 1991 is chilling. Equally so, terror in Timor and the self-censorship of mainstream media reporting on it. Unless we think that that was in the past, look no further than West Papua, a brutal modern-day example of a story that may as well be virtually non-existent. David Robie's book reads like the man. There's no fancy bells and whistles. It's a stripped back and honest look at the region facing many challenges. Don't Spoil My Beautiful Face is not only a valuable tool for budding journalists, it's essential reading for anyone who cares about the Pacific. I am privileged to know David Robie. He is a great colleague, but also a mentor who has been unfailingly supportive to me working in this region. I was very proud to be asked to launch this book, but it was a risky move, given I am often out of the country. Sadly, that has proven to be the case here, but I will conclude by saying this: David Robie, a leading advocate for media freedom and quality journalism, has yet again proven he is a brilliant author. And on that note, it is my privilege and pleasure to, if I may hold up a book, officially launch David Robie's Please Don't Spoil My Beautiful Face. Please put your hands together for David.
Thanks very much, Sandra, and also Barbara from afar. Kia ora tātou. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Warm Pacific greetings to everybody, and thanks very much for coming along and giving so much support for this book. Firstly, I'd like to make just some words of thanks to all those who have contributed to this book in many ways, and also contributed to my journey to actually reach these pages in this book. And first on my list is actually my wife, Del Absadi, and the book is dedicated to her for her own commitment to human rights over many, many years. When I first met her, she'd been campaigning for the end of the Marcos regime in the Philippines with an NGO activist organisation, along with many others, and People Power overthrown the Marcos regime. And for the past couple of decades, she's actually kept me on track, not only with this book, with many other projects as well. And the fact is, without her, I would never have got this book finished. For those of you who've had a chance to actually look at the book, and I see quite a few have, I'm pleased, you may be surprised by the long list of acknowledgements. And many of you are here today are actually on those acknowledgements. It even surprised me how long the list was. But when you consider that this book spans more than 3 decades of Pacific reportage and challenges, I had many people who helped me at key moments during this along the way for the journey. There was the Kanaki era, and there was the Tahiti Nui era. There was environmental journalism era, and there was also the Rainbow Warrior era. And I see Margaret and Trevor here. Great to see you here today. And you know, and then I had 10 years with Dell living in Papua New Guinea and Fiji. Sadly, some of these people who've been crucial to my journey have passed on. To name a few, peace researcher Owen Wilkes and the French Polynesian stewards, Marie-Therese and Bengt Danielson among them. And I thank them all for the contribution and support, and also for the contribution and support from our Pacific Media Centre's advisory panel and so on. You can find your names in the book as well. But thank you so much for the support over the years. But I especially want to thank Tony Morrow, Evatia Tamoa, Robin Byrne, Mike Wagger. Is Mike?
You don't see him actually. He was going to come.
Right. So he was the editor of the book, and Amy Tamsel did the design work and so on, and all the team at Little Island Press to make all this possible. As I say, they're all named in the book. Little Island may be a small publisher, as its name suggests, but cut by for such a huge effort. And now some comments about Don't Spoil My Beautiful Face itself. Some might find the book has an unorthodox approach. For 2/3 of its content, I took essentially a series of episodic articles written over periods of time. And with the advantage of hindsight, I put them in a context while retaining the integrity of the original writing. One of the frustrating elements of news media is the inability to retain more than a short-term memory about events as they unfold. And so often the context is completely, simply absent. I wanted to pick up from where I left off with my book Blood on Their Banner in 1989, when I was still working as a journalist before I went into media education, and also at Tungala in 2002, and provide some fresh insights. Also, in 1994, when I was at the University of Papua New Guinea, I launched Pacific Journalism Review. I'm pleased to see a few copies of that with Little Island Press. And I must acknowledge there's a crew of our students from the School of Communication Studies that are actually doing a short doco about Pacific Journalism Review at the moment. Anyway, in 20 years, that journal has forged an enviable reputation for investigative journalism and independent research, unshackled by the agendas of donor organisations. This style of journalism actually led to a methodology which I developed after I became a media educator while I was actually at UPNG and then later on at the University of the South Pacific before coming to AUT. And it's been evolving ever since. Basically, it's called critical development journalism, not to be confused with forms of development journalism misrepresented by many Pacific politicians and by many journalists as well, particularly from Western countries, seeking misrepresenting as something that's simply a form of journalism that means that Pacific politicians get off the hook and they avoid public accountability. No, critical development journalism is a robust form of journalism investigating political and social process and policy. It is still speaking power to truth, it's still speaking truth to power, but as well as seeking accountability, it tries to find a constructive edge leading to solutions. The Asia-Pacific region is poorly reported and underreported in the New Zealand media, and has been for years. Only one institution consistently covers itself with credit when covering the region, and that is Radio New Zealand International. Although Māori Television's current affairs program Native Affairs has also done some excellent Pacific work, and in fact is our main investigative program in this country now. Although Rinzi only has a fraction of the resources of its cousin across the Tasman, Radio Australia plus ABC Television, it does an excellent and credible job. But with the honourable exceptions of individual journalists, such as TVNZ's Barbara Drever, I'm so sorry she wasn't able to be here today, but she's done some wonderful work in the Pacific, and particularly to raise issues that are not really being covered by many other media. And the other person I must mention is Fairfax Media's Michael Field, and both of them are banned by the Bainimarama regime in Fiji. So apart from these two in particular, the mainstream and legacy media is patchy at best in its coverage of the region. The poor level of reporting means that we are frequently misinformed, or we get a one-dimensional view of developments, which is barely half the story. Our treatment of Fiji is an example of this. The hypocrisy and double standards over the reporting of radical changes in post-coup Fiji have not only blinded us about the realities, but has also prevented us seeing other critical issues around the region. In many respects, the illegal Bainimarama regime has been a pariah ever since the military coup in 2006. But it shouldn't be forgotten that, that the so-called democracy that was overthrown was actually an extremist and corrupt ethno-nationalist regime masquerading as democratic. Also, the reality is that this same military-backed regime that's in power now is likely to become the elected government in the general election in September. Orchestrated and manipulated, perhaps, but the regime does have a lot of genuine support in rural areas, and at least this process will open up the door to a real democracy for the future. For the doomsayers, there's very little difference from when the original coup leader, Sitiveni Rabuka, made the transition from hardline military dictator to elected Prime Minister in 1992. Paranoia reigns when the regime's bureaucrats deal with the media, and there is a climate of timid self-censorship in Fiji under the control of the dictatorial Media Industry Development Tribunal, except for a handful of courageous and dissident journalists such as Ricardo Morris and his wonderful Republica magazine. Actually, Fiji is not the biggest worry in the region by a long shot. Indonesian repression in the two Melanesian provinces that make up the West Papua region, and the climate of impunity in the Philippines, where journalists are assassinated with ease, are serious crises in the region. But when do you read about these issues in the New Zealand media? At least 206 journalists have been murdered in the Philippines since 1986. 34 of them in one incident alone, the Ampatuan massacre in Mindanao in 2009. More than 4 years later, nobody has been convicted for these atrocities. The Philippines is a far more dangerous place for the media under democracy than it was under the Marcos military dictatorship. And now, a controversial law in the Philippines billed by critics as electronic martial law that criminalises e-libel may be mimicked in the Pacific. The Supreme Court in Manila ruled in December 2012 to temporarily suspend this law, and then extended it until further notice in February 2013. However, in February this year, the Supreme Court ruled that the law was indeed constitutional, effectively expanding the country's 80-year-old libel law into the digital domain. Now, in Papua New Guinea, the Peter O'Neill government has signalled an impending onslaught against stridently critical social media with a draft new cybercrime law. Under proposed legislation, recently considered by the Cabinet in Port Moresby, the National Information and Communication Technology Authority would be granted powers to act against individual attacks on social media. The agency would be able to routinely monitor SIM cards with a full biometric scan, and it would become illegal for people to use pseudonyms for social media postings. This is in a country where social media has grown exponentially in recent years. So bloggers in Papua New Guinea are now up in arms about the proposed legal powers. Opposition leader Belden Nama has described this development as dangerous for Papua New Guinea's traditional freedom of speech. He says Prime Minister O'Neill should grow a thick skin. The proposed PNG legislation mirrors in some respects the Cybercrime Prevention Act in the Philippines, where an offender can be imprisoned for up to 12 years without parole, and the law is regarded by critics as a violation of Article 19 of the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights. Truth is not recognised as a defence. Last month in Thailand, the indictment of 2 journalists, Alan Morrison and Shautima Sedastian, for alleged criminal libel under a similar computer crime act, may spell doom for the online news website Phuket One. West Papua is the most critical front line for the defending media freedom in the South Pacific at present. The West Papua Freedom Flotilla last September focused unprecedented global attention on human rights and freedom of expression in the Indonesian rural region. And the Vanuatu Prime Minister, Moana Kakses Kalasil, made this wonderful speech in the United Nations Human Rights Council last month, and he appealed for a decisive act to end the international neglect of the West Papuan people. And just to quote something of what he said, from his speech, since the controversial Act of Free Choice in 1969, the Melanesian people of West Papua have been subject to ongoing human rights violations committed by the Indonesian security forces. The world has witnessed the litany of tortures, murders, exploitation, rapes, military raids, arbitrary arrests, and dividing of civil society through intelligence operations. In this climate of fear and repression of political dissent and blatant negligence by the international community, including the United Nations, and the powerful developed countries since 1969, we find this forgotten race still dare to dream for equality and justice. Yet, the democratic nations have kept silent. New Zealand is among those silent nations. Nowhere was this landmark speech reported in New Zealand media. But serious though the West Papuan plight is, the spectre of climate change hangs over the entire Pacific, while the major industrial powers dither over serious and urgent carbon policy reforms. Another media freedom issue is Australia's shameful human rights violations and suppression of information about asylum seekers, leading to inquiries into the killing of 23-year-old Iranian Reza Barati while in custody on Manus Island. Anybody who's actually seen the footage that The Age newspaper published just recently about when the security guards went into the camp and the violence that led to his death, it's very revealing. More than 3,000 asylum seekers are living in detention camps in Nauru and Papua New Guinea, deprived of their human rights and with no hope for the future. Through the so-called Pacific solution, Australia has simply attempted to dump responsibility on 2 nations for a price, and it wants to bring in other Pacific countries as well. Fiji has been floated as a possibility, and others. Journalism must fundamentally change in the Pacific to cope with the challenges. Far more investigative journalism is needed, or as I would say, more critical development journalism. More education and training is needed, and not just the sort of self-interested short-term training served up by donor agencies. Finally, I would like to conclude with a quote from Martin Luther King. No, we are not satisfied and will not be satisfied until justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. Thanks so much.
I had a look at the book quickly yesterday when I was given a copy by David, and I was amazed by the variety of contexts, different countries covered, different issues covered in one volume. It's not easy to do that for those of us who do research and write, because often we focus on an issue over time, but being able to focus on so many issues over a series of, if you like, time frames is even more difficult. And I'm sure that this book will go a long way, like I said earlier in my introduction. This may be a work in progress. Perhaps by the end of next year, we'll see you again here. So thank you very much, David. Let's give David another big hand.
Thank you so much for coming all over. Yeah. And I'm so glad.